These are the items that I'm going to cover, and I'll do a brief introduction as well. I'm going to talk about what is land use and development, run through a few real estate terms, just so we kind of have a level playing field. I'll touch on some state legislation that has had some changes in real estate and business. And then Carolina said the kind of how can business and local government work together for its community. So I am a partner at Brownstein here in Denver. We are a large law firm, kind of do a variety of work, but my work is land use and zoning and general real estate. So I am often representing developers who are looking to buy and develop a piece of property, and I help them figure out what they can build there. And if they can't build what they want to build, is there a way to modify the zoning to do that? And if not, where else can they look, right? And so understanding that kind of risk analysis is often how I'm advising my clients on the land use front. I also serve as special counsel to a number of cities and counties on kind of real estate related issues, and then do a lot of urban renewal and public finance. And so I'll touch on that in the last slide. I also, as was noted, there's an organization called NAIOP Colorado, which represents commercial real estate interests nationally, and I chaired or was president of and still serve on the board of our Colorado chapter. And so I've had the chance to work with a lot of real estate professionals in that capacity and advocate, speaking at the Capitol on behalf of commercial real estate. I also serve on and chair the Denver Planning Board. So in Lakewood, you have a planning commission. In Denver, it is the planning board. Our meeting is this afternoon. So I will be spending my time there in the afternoons reviewing rezonings and other plans that come before us. We're looking at our downtown area plan this afternoon, for example. So I'm just going to start by defining what land use is. It is kind of the laws and what's hard about land use is it's not in one particular book, right? It is state statutes, it is regulations, it is local code, permits, and then the various zoning and entitlement approvals. But really the crux is it's what governs what structures and uses can be engaged on a property. You know, how tall can a building be? Is it an industrial use or a residential use, or is it a mix of uses? So what's allowed where? And I would say the other piece that's part of land use, and Travis might touch on this in a little bit, is community planning, right? What is a vision for the community? And where does a community see more density or less density, or see some of the more intensive uses or not? And so those land use plans are so important because they really should direct investment and direct development to certain areas. Why do we care about land use? Well, as I said, I mean, I'm often representing developers looking at buying certain properties, and they want to understand, you know, what can I build there? What business could I have there? And if this isn't the right property, where else should I be looking? It can really limit, you know, height, density, siting, parking requirements. And so understanding what those are kind of coming into a property is really important to see if it's the right fit for the developer and right fit for the community. So this is a little bit of a joke slide, but I do have to touch on it because I think we come to development and projects with all different perspectives. And we've got up here in the corner kind of a typical shopping center, right? You have a couple of major tenants, some inline retail, some parking, and then you have what a major tenant would love this shopping center to look like, right? Like all roads lead to Rome, come to my Whole Foods, come to my Target, whatever that major tenant is. Every access point and curb cut they can get, some big signage on the corner to attract people to them, very little landscaping because they want you to see their business. And then you have maybe the developer, right? They're down in the corner, so this is the master developer for the site. They really want to maximize the number of tenants they can have. They want to make parking accessible, but find the right balance. And then I do have to joke, not to give Lakewood a hard time, but right, a shopping center is seen by a city. You've got, all this green space and landscaping, kind of a city library. Maybe there's a little bit of retail in the businesses, some housing, ideally affordable housing, right? And the goal of land use, and the goal, I think, of your city and your businesses coming together and your community is to meet somewhere in the middle of all of that, right? And find that community vision that works for the city and the community, that also works for your tenants, that also works for the developer, so that it actually gets built. And so we're trying to kind of blend all of those. I will touch on some real estate terminology just so that, it's kind of an opportunity to learn some of these. You might know all of them, maybe none of them. So an RFP, a request for proposal. So this can be done in private real estate, where a document is used to essentially solicit offers from buyers or solicit offers from landlords or sellers. Often government uses RFPs as well, right? The government owns a piece of land and they'll go out for an RFP to the development community and say, please come propose what you would like to build here to us. A PSA, which is a purchase and sale contract used to buy and sell property. A ROFO or a ROFR. Those are often talked about between a seller and a buyer that gives a right of first offer or a right of first refusal. So for example, if you're selling a property and you want to sell it to this buyer, but if that buyer ever goes away, if they want to sell, you want the first right to buy it back. And so you would, as part of that sale, can include a ROFR or ROFO and give yourself that right back as a seller. Due diligence or inspection period. So this is part of a purchase and sale agreement where the buyer has a contracted amount of time to go diligence a property. They're going to run environmental. They're going to prepare a survey. They're going to review the title to see if there's anything problematic. If there's a giant easement running through the middle of that property, they want to figure that out. If there's an underground storage tank, they want to figure that out. And so typically what happens in a purchase contract is you put up, and I have this down below, earnest money. So you put up a certain deposit under a purchase contract that sits with often a title company. And then during that period, while the deposit is not non-refundable, or in our language we call it like the deposit going hard, during that refundable time period, the buyer is doing that diligence. They're investigating that property. And then at a certain deadline, that earnest money deposit becomes non-refundable and the parties proceed towards closing. A pro forma. So this gets talked a lot and you'll often hear, is that pro forma going to pencil? And what that means is, it's this estimated financial statement for a project. So the developer kind of thinks about all of the costs that are going to go into the project and then tries to figure out kind of what type of profit they can make to see if it actually makes sense to proceed with the project. And there's always that break-even point where they're not going to be able to get someone to give them a loan on it, and they're not going to be able to finance the project. And so you hear a lot of conversations about, kind of that break point on a pro forma where it doesn't make sense to proceed. And then loan to value, LTV. So that's a ratio comparing a loan amount to a property's value. Big conversation when you're talking with lenders about kind of that loan to value to determine if they want to provide a loan or not. Let's see, I touched on earnest money, and then the closing is really that final step in a real estate transaction where the property is actually conveyed with a deed. This slide is a little bit more on the leasing side. The first one was kind of more real estate transactional side. But this first one, a market survey or available property overview, this is a package that a broker puts together when they're essentially advertising or trying to share the news about a property. That could be for a sale or a lease. So you'll often see kind of those summaries of, it kind of looks like an ad, but it has a lot of details about the property on it too. And sometimes you'll see that as called a flyer or an offering memorandum as well. That can include a little bit more detail. The next step is, okay, let's say they've, marketed a property for lease and there's a viable landlord and a viable tenant. The first step is typically an LOI or a letter of intent. And that lays out the key terms between the parties. It's not a contract, but it does kind of give that initial agreement of, yeah, we agree that this is the right rent. And we agree this is how we're going to handle utilities. And this is the term of our lease. It's going to be 5 years or 10 years, or it can be renewed at a new rate, right? All those kind of key details you lay out in an LOI that is typically negotiated by the brokers for a landlord and tenant so that they can make sure there's kind of a meeting of the minds before they go spend a bunch of energy, drawing up a full lease. A triple net lease, a net. This is a common term, but the idea is basically the tenant pays rent plus property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. So really the tenant is kind of taking on both the rent, but also all the costs related to that property. It's kind of like a full pass-through. So sometimes that means that the tenant is actually directly paying for those property taxes, and other times the landlord is kind of giving them a total amount and saying, here's, what you owe us in additional rent in addition to your just rent for the space. OpEx and CAM, often talked about. Slightly different, but they can often be kind of conflated. So OpEx is operating expenses, whereas that's kind of the ongoing kind of operation for a property. CAM, common area maintenance. So expenses like landscaping, maintaining parking, lighting, sidewalks. So management fees, taxes, insurance, that's CAM. And you'll often see that in a lease as an additional expense. So understanding what will the CAM be is a key piece of a lease. And then CapEx. Depending on the lease negotiations, a tenant may or may not help towards CapEx, but that may be a landlord cost, right? It's a capital expenditure. So much like a homeowner, every so often I have to replace my dryer, I have to replace my furnace, and that's kind of the concept with CapEx. That's typically a landlord investment, but not always, but to make those kind of big investments in the property to keep it up. And then a cap rate. This is a measure of return on investment for a property, and it's based on the income that it generates. And this is often talked about when someone is evaluating kind of a property to determine if it makes sense for an investment or sense for a purchase, is what is the cap rate on a project. All right, so I always include this slide because I think we all have to be able to laugh at ourselves. So we just did a whole bunch of real estate defined terms, and these are some land use acronyms that we see around. So NIMBY, not in my backyard. You might know that one. YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. That was just an expression, but it's actually a real group now. There are YIMBY organizations all around Colorado. Nope, not on planet Earth. Banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. A LULU, a locally undesirable land use. You think of a cement plant, a landfill. No one wants to live next to it, but gosh, we still need someone to pick up our garbage and we need someone to pave our roads, right? So those LULUs, and where do they go and where do we place them as a community? And I will admit on this last one, I, from time to time, represent DUDES, which are developers under delusions of entitlement. And I wouldn't say the vast majority of my clients are wonderful people who really care about their community and are often local developers and live in that community. But every now and again, a little bit of a reality check for our DUDES. All right, moving on to some recent state legislation. So as many of you probably saw in headlines, we had the 2025 legislative session, and then we had a recent 2025 special session. And both were really, really focused on a budget crisis. $1.2 billion in the shortfall in the state's general fund. And so you weren't seeing a lot of new expenditures. This is just kind of high level. It was really interesting because, as you may know, Democrats control the Senate and the House and the governorship. But the Democrats did not have a supermajority. And so that meant that Governor Polis could and did veto bills that he felt kind of went too far on the left side. And so they did have to contend, the legislature had to contend with the Polis veto power throughout the session. But that was a really interesting thing to kind of see a Democratic governor, and he has for the last number of years kind of have to move much more towards the center to try and kind of bring that check against his own party, frankly. And in the special session, they were really focused on budget adjustments and short-term fixes, right? The budget continued to be a problem. Some additional health care protections to back some of the things that happened at the federal level. And unfortunately, they attempted to reach some agreement related to an AI bill. Colorado is the first state to pass a really significant AI regulation bill. And there are some fixes that are needed in the bill. And the hope was to approve those. It did not happen. And so that has been basically kicked to the next legislative session. So you will probably come January hear a lot about AI. So in 2025, I'll just touch on a few bills that passed that I think are relevant for kind of business and real estate. Senate Bill 5 was really, I think, unfortunately kind of set the tone and a contentious tone for the start of the session. And that involved an attempt to eliminate what was a second union vote for employees that were unionized. That did actually end up being vetoed by the governor. But it really, it got proposed, obviously, Senate Bill 5, early bill, and it was proposed kind of right at the start of the session, and I think really started those relationships, unfortunately, pretty tense. So it did not pass. I think there's the potential we'll see something come back on that front. Workers' compensation reform. So this shifted some burdens from employees to employers. It was controversial. Some thought Polis might veto it. He did not. So there are some reforms that have been put in place on that front, more towards kind of giving more rights to workers, I would say, on being able to make workers' compensation claims. There was a really interesting bill around extreme weather worker protection. So the contractors in the room probably had their eyes on this one. It was PI'd, which means postponed indefinitely. So it was essentially killed in the legislature because they didn't have the votes. But we do expect that one to come back. And then the next one is wage theft enforcement. So again, employer-employee expanded the definitions of what an employer is, increased some penalties, and actually, interesting, gave local government the power to enforce some of those laws to make sure that employers are properly paying their employees, and if they aren't, that those employees have more rights around making those claims. But I think on the whole, kind of a very employee-friendly session with some legislative changes there. Housing and land use legislation. So House Bill 1169, we were just talking about NIMBYs and YIMBYs. There was a new one that came up, YIGBY, yes, in God's backyard. And the concept was that for for church and school zone land, it was schools too, but church and school zone land, that they could actually bypass the local process around zoning and to develop housing on those properties. And there's a lot of, in particular, churches kind of entering this space to try and do affordable housing on excess land that they have. And this was a bill to attempt to kind of expedite those types of projects. It failed in the Senate. There was a lot of pushback from local cities, in particular. Colorado Municipal League is the lobbying group that lobbies on behalf of cities, and they didn't want to give up their local control, right? There were some, it wasn't like you could build a 20-story tall building or something on the church-owned land, but there was some kind of regulation around the heights. But it would have been a very expedited permit path, where right now most church property is not zoned for residential use and you have to go through a rezoning, et cetera, et cetera. This may come back, we'll see, but it was a really interesting piece on land use of kind of state versus local control versus trying to facilitate more housing more quickly. This was House Bill 1273 on single stair multifamily buildings. This was a really, I think, great progression. Having 2 stairs has been a requirement for a long time, which makes a lot of the, especially multifamily buildings, you have to kind of have a certain size lot, and your building sort of gets kind of stuck in a certain shape to be able to facilitate those. And I know a lot of people don't love those kind of squared, blocky buildings, and some of that was because of the building code and the requirements around stairs. This allows certain buildings to only have to do 1 stair, so it allows some of the smaller lots, smaller buildings to be developed, whereas before they couldn't be developed. So I'm really interested to see the next step for single stair is individual communities have to change their building codes to follow it, and so we'll see that change over time with building codes. A lot of people talk about construction defects reform. House Bill 1272 did pass. Basically, it creates this kind of quality assurance program that developers can opt into. And if you do all of these extra things up front, then if there is a construction defect claim, you get a kind of a different process that better protects the developer. I think we will see. I think it was a baby step. And what we really have to see is what the insurance market does. Because the problem with construction defects, and particularly around building condominiums and kind of connected homes that are often on the more affordable side, is that construction defect claims can be made. And getting insurance by developers to defend against those construction defect claims is terribly expensive in Colorado. And in fact, there's only a couple of insurers who even do it. And so I think this is good progress. What we have to see is, does the insurance market change? Because unless the insurance market changes for developers who want to build condominiums in particular, but townhomes that are connected is another example, then it doesn't really matter, right? Because they're having to balance their pro forma, the term we talked about before. And if the insurance costs don't change, the condo doesn't get built in a more affordable way. And they don't build the condo, they build a multifamily building instead. House Bill 1004, algorithm rent pricing. This is kind of a touch on AI, but it prohibits landlords from using rent-setting software. This passed, but it was actually vetoed by Governor Polis. I think we'll see versions of this come back. The idea is that using AI and using even just kind of software that collects data and then compares, was making recommendations on kind of what is market for a landlord to set rent at. I think the worry was that can also allow landlords to sort of collude and everybody raises their prices and it's not actually honoring what is market price, right? So those were kind of the two sides on this issue. But finding a way to allow the market to kind of look left and look right and say, yeah, this is the right rent to charge, I think is important. But at the same time, not allowing landlords to all decide, let's charge $200 more because we can, right? And so how do you get a bill? I think we'll see that come back in a different way this coming year. And then security deposits, that was a bill to reform that. So now deposits can only be 1 month's rent, and you can and requires installment options for those. All right, I'm sorry, I've got this kind of thing popping up over here on the screen. I am almost done. I just wanted to touch on House Bill 1090. This is an important one. If you are doing commercial or residential leases, pretty much everybody has had to change, not everybody, almost everyone has had to change how they do leasing. So something to be very aware of around kind of all those additional fees that can get tagged on with CAM or otherwise. So happy to touch on this one if you have more questions. But we have certainly found from our landlord clients, almost all of them are having to go look back at their leases to make sure that they're doing this correctly and disclosing properly. So this is my last slide just on business and local government working together. One of the reasons that you all are here is because you work with your local economic development office and you want to be engaged with government. And I think that that's one of the best opportunities to kind of see a vision out for a community. So obviously you met some of the people from your economic development office, but knowing them and talking to them, especially when you're coming into a community or wanting to build in a community, I mean, often people think to talk to planning, but they don't talk to economic development. And I think it can be a really important office to get to know. And they can often connect you with a variety of different grants that they have, or a revolving loan fund, or a facade improvement grant program. I know in Lakewood you have an adaptive reuse program, for example, and then the commercial reinvestment program. So they can tell you about these things, and maybe it's some additional money that can go towards your project. One of the newer concepts around kind of partnering with local government is land banking. And this can be where a city or an urban renewal authority or a community nonprofit owns the fee part of the property, and then the improvement gets built. Great resource in affordable housing often. That removes the tax burden of the fee component, and you only pay property taxes on the improvement. So that's a kind of a new concept a lot of communities are looking at. I mentioned that I do a lot of urban renewal authority work. Tax increment financing is a mechanism. I know Lakewood uses it as well. But for certain projects that are really difficult kind of infill projects that otherwise are not penciling on their pro forma, tax increment financing can be a method to try and help those kind of close that gap. Depending on certain projects, development agreements that have incentives, but also expectations for projects, right? Yes, we will give you some of your sales tax share back. We'll do that as a community, but we want to see some additional housing, or we want to see some additional affordable housing, I should say, or we want to see some additional landscaping, right? So often those agreements kind of come with a trade or an agreement between the parties. Affordable housing incentives, tax-exempt bonds, which are something that communities have, and then special districts, metropolitan districts, business improvement districts. They essentially, once created and established, they can impose an additional mill levy on the property taxes, and then the district can use that mill levy either to fund public improvements up front, to build the streets, put in the sewers, et cetera, all that horizontal work that happens in a project, and then kind of pay it back over time with bonds. It can also, kind of do ongoing maintenance. I think there's a lot of sensitivity to metropolitan districts in particular because depending on the mill levy, it can be significant. And I think both residents and commercial developers have to be aware of what is palatable and what makes sense. But because of where we live in Colorado and we have Tabor, cities are not paying for those roads. They don't have the budget to build a new road for a new development. And so often developers are looking at these special districts as a mechanism. I will stop. I've probably gone on longer than intended. I'm happy to do some Q&A now, or Travis can come up and kind of talk about planning, and we can talk at the end too. But what would you like to do? Okay. Oh, there's a question.
So, more of this economic development, what would you say in today's environment you're seeing as the biggest issue to kind of get these development projects from concept to actually where you want?
I think it goes back to the pro forma. Honestly, because particularly around construction pricing, I think it is so volatile and so unknown that is a real, I mean, it's breaking pro formas left and right. And so you can see a project go through entitlements, and then they're just kind of pushing their GC and pushing their architect down the road. You know, we want to build, but we have to wait. We have to wait. And so I think it really is going to be around construction pricing in particular. I also think that the capital market is very, very cautious. And so the lenders are asking for more collateral, a higher loan to value, and the expectations to be able to get a loan are a lot higher than they were. I think those are the two I'd say. Yeah. Other questions?
What from municipalities or kind of low-hanging fruit that you recommend that municipalities or local jurisdictions think about to help developers? Or
Many. But I think one of them that I often talk about is risk and predictability. I have had clients who they understand that it's difficult to develop in a certain community, but they would rather understand this is going to be a 2-year process, and here's what we expect of you. And if you do all these things, like there's a path, and they would rather know that up front and just be transparent about this is our community's process and this is our timeline and here's your risk, rather than kind of, I think it's more about being able to make that decision up front and assess their risk. And I think understanding that, and I think economic development offices are helpful for that, planning offices are helpful, but to really be able to say, like, is this the right project for me in this community or not? But what they don't want to do is spend a year investing that time, investing a lot of money, planning for a project, and then realize, oh, well, if I'd known that I was never going to be able to rezone this, and that was just kind of going to be a non-starter for the community, gosh, I wish I'd known that a year ago. So I think it's really around predictability, to be able to invest a lot of money up front to kind of get to that end goal. I actually have a question. I know construction law, the defect law has effectively stopped the development of all for sale units in Colorado. I know there have been some changes recently. Where those stats stand? Yeah, so I touched on the one House bill. I mean, that's really the only progress that was made in the last legislative session, and I think it's going to take several years to see if that actually shook anything loose and if insurance pricing changes. So unfortunately, I think there has been no change right now, and it is still very difficult to build condominiums. And until the legislature has a real significant change in those laws, I do not think you're going to see a lot of developers doing it, unfortunately. And I think there's a lot that want to, but you only sort of see high-end condos being built right now because it's so expensive. Yeah.
So you talked with Marcus's question about risks in developing in certain communities. How is Lakewood viewed by developers as far as, is it a risky place to develop or not just us?
Oh gosh, I can't make that judgment call. I think I often say it really depends on what it's right around. I mean, I would say I think your city as staff are great to work with and really communicative. But I think it is going to depend on the property and the community around it if it's the right fit. And so I think it's very site specific when it comes to things like that to see if it's the right fit for a community. And I don't mean community like the city of Lakewood. I mean like that local community right around it. Yeah. Yeah.
How do developers feel about infill development?
Well, I think it depends on the developer. Oh, sure. Her question was, how do developers feel about infill development? So kind of those sites that have maybe sat vacant and need to be demolished and built, or are just vacant, but kind of internal to a core of a city. I think you have certain developers who just don't do that sort of stuff. And they are, kind of greenfield. This is my lane. This is what I build, and I want an untouched property. And you have other developers who love that sort of thing and love a complex financing structure and are willing to talk about urban renewal and tax increment, because often that's necessary for an infill site. So I think it really depends on the developer and their level of expertise to be able to come in, because without fail, those infills are more complicated and more difficult to finance. And so I think you have to have a developer who's kind of willing to take that risk and invest the time to do them and to care about a community a little bit more, right? I mean, I think it's easier to go, sprawl and build another, no offense, build another kind of sprawl shopping retail center or something. But I think it takes real commitment by the community and the developer to do those infill sites. And so I think it's finding the right fit. Yeah.
Yes, I am an investor as well as I work in the title business, and I have for many years. One of the things that I wonder why Lakewood doesn't look at, I just look at Lakewood, other states or other parts of the state have, because I've purchased a conversion. So you need an apartment building, and as long as you get past that 7-year builder defect block, they can break it down so that they sell them as individual units. Do you see that very much? Because I don't see that very much happening, but I have purchased those types of items in the past, but I haven't seen any for a while.
Yeah, you're right. It can happen. I think there isn't as much of a market for it, but certain developers will come in. You basically come in at that kind of when the risk of construction defect litigation goes down, that statute of limitations ends. They can come in and do a condominium map and set up the structure to sell off units. There's a few that sort of specialize in that work, but I think it's complicated, and I don't know that they're seeing the market for it. But I do see them around. I wouldn't say, and I don't know if Travis has anything to add, I don't think there's anything in Lakewood that makes it more difficult to do that. I think it's just finding the right property that makes sense, that, to put the investment in to do that condominium and then feel like you're going to be able to sell the units at the right price.
I think you're still open to the law.
There can be some risk depending on like the work that you put into it again to do the conversion, right? And there are some different requirements, and then suddenly you kind of restart that time clock. Yeah.
Well, there's some questions on what you move it, individual billing, you move it, because the air conditioning you get with it, and then you want to have it broken down to particular units because
Right.
on each key. So those type of infrastructures are going to be in there as well too.
Yeah.
That have to be done, but it can be done, and I've seen it work very well.
Yeah. One of those things I actually have seen a lot more activity in is conversion of older hotels who are maybe not performing as well to housing. I am seeing that a lot. I diligence a lot of those on behalf, because they have different parking requirements and code requirements sometimes. But I think that that is a kind of more viable financial space right now. Of course, they're being converted to apartments, not condos typically. But we're seeing that a lot more with those kind of mid-level hotels.
Right.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the zoning update that we're going through. You heard about, what land use is and how it works, and I'm going to talk about some of the updates we're doing here. I've only got a really quick, short presentation because, as we all know, zoning talk right after lunch is a great nap inducer. So I'll talk for a few minutes, but I'm happy to be here as long as you want to talk about questions. So basically, zoning should support and implement the comprehensive plan. We've been working in Lakewood for over 2 years on a new comprehensive plan. It was just approved a couple of months ago by our city council. We spent 2 years in the community working with neighborhood groups, working with individuals, working with a task force that we had appointed to determine where we wanted to go as a community. And so all of the changes in our zoning code are really complementary to that process and are really the cap of that process. That then forms the primary input of our zoning changes, but we had some other inputs as well. There are a few House bills in 2024 that required some changes to local zoning codes that we included in our changes. We had a lot of input from Planning Commission and City Council and what they wanted to see in a new zoning code. And then there was a lot of stuff that we did for clarity and technical updates as the enforcers and implementers of the zoning code. Staff has a lot of experience with what works and what doesn't. So we recommended some changes of our own. Just really high level, and we can dig into this any of this more if you'd like to. The main changes are here on the screen. The main, I think, largest change that we're hearing about and that's in the news now is increased housing opportunity in Lakewood. So we completely rewrote our residential districts. So what were previously single-family residential districts now offer more opportunity for more different housing types. Part of this was in response to a House Bill 1007 that now prohibits cities from limiting the number of people that live in a home. And so Lakewood's existing code doesn't have an upper cap for building size in a residential district, which means if you have it's just capped by height and by setbacks. So if you've got a 12,000 square foot lot, you can literally, under today's code, build a 20,000 square foot single family home, right, with 20 bedrooms. We don't see a lot of that because prior to 1007, you're limited to a blood-related family or 5 individuals. Now we can't limit the number of unlimited individuals. So a group home could have 40 people in it, in one of these. So what we did with our new residential districts is limit the overall size of a building in these districts, but in exchange, we now don't limit the number of units in that building. So our basic unit or size limitation is now 4,000 square feet for a structure in these districts, but if you want to do 2, 3, 4 units in it, that's allowed. We also lowered the lot sizes so that the city can have a bit more housing density in these areas. As a result of another state law, we've removed many of the parking minimums across the city. So everything within a quarter mile of a bus line or half mile of a transit station now has no minimum parking requirement for residential uses. We expect that residential uses will still require financing and will still have parking, but that won't be as a result of our minimum requirements. We did keep a couple things. We kept a requirement for visitor spaces. We do have some, like 1 per 15 or 20 units for visitors, and we have some loading requirements, but it's pretty minimal what we kept for parking requirements. And then we've made changes to sustainability. Our council wanted to make updates to our enhanced development menu. They were really interested in defending or buffering parks from the impacts of development. So there's some additional setbacks and some additional requirements when we were building near a large park in Lakewood. And finally, they wanted to add a little more public review to some entitled site plans specifically around parks. So new developments adjacent to a 10-acre or greater park now have an additional neighborhood meeting for entitled projects. It's a lot more, but again, don't want to take too much time or dig too deep into things you're not interested in, but happy to dig into any more of this if you've got questions. In terms of timing, after 3 hearings, the text has all been approved by City Council. They have one more hearing on the 13th of October to approve the zoning map that maps these new districts that have been created. And all of this will go into effect, absent a referendum, all of this will go into effect on January 1st. So that's where we stand. Happy to take questions. Yes, Guy?
About right. I'm assuming that the Housing for Everyone groups.
And you request speak up or
So there's a group obviously protesting these changes. If they are successful, I'm assuming that there will be conflict between the state requirements and what they want, or is that, do we know yet what sort of their
The main Well, they're asking for repeal of the new code in its entirety.
Not meeting the state requirements, and so
Would-
that conflict, how does that get worked out?
So that's a great question. Some of our, if we go back to today's code, some of it might not be enforceable, specifically the parking requirements, right? And the limitation on number of people in a household. So we'd have to, if the referendum is successful, we end up with today's code, we'd have to talk with legal about whether and how we enforce those particular requirements. Yes, ma'am.
I was under the impression that you were going to be limiting single-family dwellings. That's
Not at all.
word that out there that
that-
trying to get that limited, as well as the parking spaces of a 1.25 per household. Is that where it's going, or where is that going?
So the new code is more flexible, not more restrictive. So we're not limiting anything. You can still build a single family home under the new code anywhere you could build under the old code. Also with parking, you can build parking where you want to under the new code or the old code. It's just more flexible. So right now, in much of the city, you have a minimum of 1.2 parking spaces per unit for multifamily. Under the new code, if you're near transit, you don't have a minimum. You can still have 1.25 or double that. You could have 2 spaces per unit, but it's not a requirement of the city that you do. And same for single family. Our zones that now allow single family homes will continue to allow single family homes, but if you want to split that single family home into 2 units, you can do that too.
But if you have a single-family dwelling and somebody next door wants to utilize it as a 4 or 8-plex, will you have any say-so as a single-family dwelling owner
Over your neighbor's property?
over your neighbor's property? Because
Nope.
if it's old property, then you've got, well, larger lots.
Yep.
And so how you want to have, 18 people next door.
Which is why we limited the size of the building, because even if the referendum is successful and we stick with the current code, we can't limit the number of people in a building anymore. And our current code allows giant single-family homes. So without this change, someone could come into a single-family neighborhood and build a 20,000 square foot home. With this change, they can only build 4,000 square feet. Now they can do 2 or 3 or 4 units in it, but they can only have 4,000 square feet.
Is the idea, and I kind of think of it like what we think of and what we see from the street is the building envelope, and you don't want the building to feel significantly larger than the buildings that it's around. It still sort of feels like a single family neighborhood, but inside there are more units. But by limiting the size, it feels comparable to the other buildings.
Exactly. We're controlling the building density. The states removed our ability to control the population density. We can control the building density. Yeah.
From casual observation, you can see a lot more infill in Wheat Ridge and like South Arvada, like small lot redevelopment. Is that caused by, is that encouraged by a change in zoning code that those cities did earlier than us? And does this bring us more similar to those similar municipalities, or is this more complex than just a code, a zoning?
Probably those are market forces. Yeah.
Zoning codes are similar to the new code.
Old code.
They have not done this.
No.
And
No.
Although my experience is that a lot of cities are undertaking the work that you are right now to bring their codes. Some are not. Some are suing the state about it, but some communities are doing this to bring it into compliance with the number of the bills that were mentioned.
Yes, ma'am.
So why did this not get brought to the people to vote on, as opposed to the 11 people on city council and the mayor? I would think that would be wanting to have more of a general consensus from the residents that are being taxed by taxpayers for many years.
Well, it's a function of representative government. Our council is assigned to make these decisions, so that's what they do.
But we don't always agree with it.
Then you replace them. Yes.
You speak with regard to the sustainability. I think in your presentation it went kind of fast.
Yeah.
Something, maybe some high level concept, maybe as it relates to commercial.
Sure. So we in 2019, about 6 years ago now, we created something called the Enhanced Development Menu, which is a list of additional things that projects can do that aren't required in and of themselves, but each development based on its size has to achieve a certain number of points off that list. A lot of those, the majority I'd say, are sustainability related things. So if you do solar on your roof, if you have low flow water, whatever it is, you can achieve points that way. So we've done a lot of updates to that list. So some of the most common things, we've taken them off the list, made them standard requirements, and then we've added a bunch of new sustainability options on that list. In addition, recently we've made some updates to Article 13, which it contains the sustainability stuff. We've got new greenhouse gas mitigation requirements. We've got construction, demolition requirements. So some additional requirements around sustainability in those areas as well. Yep.
Do you think the enhanced development menu can be a game changer for the city of Lakewood when it comes to new development?
I think so. It's been around a while, and we've been applying it for 6 years, and I think it's been effective in getting a lot of things that the community and the council wants out of projects without requiring specific. You know, you get your choice of this broad range of things you can do, but it's helping us promote projects that are more sustainable and provide more amenities to their immediate neighbors.